Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations episode number 55. I'm your host, Joe Hannon, Joe from Jersey. I had a night last night, guys. Had a night on the mats. One I will never forget, and one that I'm about to pour into this podcast because BJJ Meditations, first and foremost, was intended to be my live training journal. These are notes that otherwise I would be writing to myself instead of sharing them with you. So they're very much a living document. I want to capture the moment for what it is. I want to capture my reflections for what they are so I can see how they evolve over time, and also so they might be beneficial to you as well. So everything I'm about to say is something that's still very raw for me and something I'm still grappling with. So I hope you'll be okay with going along for a bit more of a bumpy ride on this episode. And hopefully we can all get something out of it. But I've been thinking a lot about how jiu-jitsu reveals who you really are. And this came into focus last night for me in a big way. But I think that jiu-jitsu has this pressure cooker effect, especially when you're enmeshed in a really challenging role with somebody. All of the affectatious aspects of your personality kind of get stripped away under that pressure. And when I say affectatious, what I mean is all of the airs that you put on, the masks that you wear, the persona that you willingly take on or unwillingly take on, all of that vanishes. I think about this cultural phenomenon here in the Northeast called the Northern Atlantic Affect. If you've ever heard it, if you ever watched Cheers or I forget the other show that Kelsey Grammer was on, Frasier. Kelsey Grammer has the Northern Atlantic affect, and it was this way of talking that became prominent in the Northeast because it connoted a certain level of education or a certain standing in society, and it sounds pseudo-British, but really it's this totally made-up thing, this totally made-up way of speaking and sounding to inauthentically or authentically convey that you're smart and that you're educated and that you're from the Northeast. You could hear it. I forget the name of the announcer, but there was this legendary New York Yankees announcer, and Derek Jeter in the last few years of his career still, after this guy had died, still used this guy as his walk-up announcer. And the way he would say Derek Jeter's last name was very Northern Atlantic affect-y. He would say Derek Cheetah. It almost sounded like he would say cheater. But yeah, that's what I mean when I say affectatious. And when you're getting the shit beaten out of you, when you're under mount or a heavy side control, or you're losing in a tournament, you're quote unquote embarrassing yourself, all of those airs that you're putting on, they just vanish. And what's left is who you really are. It's the most potent version of you in distilled form. And as an outsider to that effect, when I look at students, when I look at people from other schools, when I look at guests in our school, that's very apparent to me. But it's very hard for us to see that in ourselves. That takes some effort. And that effort is the gateway to jiu-jitsu as an examined life. But it's up to us, the individual grappler, to do that work or not do it. And, before we get into what that work is and what it looks like, I think it probably is worth examining what an examined life is in my mind. And to me, an examined life is one in which we are evaluating our frameworks, our assumptions, our biases, our values, and our behaviors. I think the most superficial way of understanding this is, let's say, religion or faith or spirituality. Is your religion, your faith, your spirituality, or lack thereof a product of informed decision-making on your part, questioning, interrogation of your values, or is it something that you simply inherited? And I'm not trying to put a valence on either of those things, okay? I'm just trying to put this out there as an objective observation or possibility. How did you come to believe what you believe? How did you come to assume what you assume? Are you present to the fact that you have biases? Like, a good example for me is I have this tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt. I have a bias toward assuming good intentions where there may not be good intentions. Now, this has its advantages. I choose to see the good in people over time. It also has its disadvantages because sometimes I overlook their darkness, and that mistake cost me. It's up to me whether I want to change my behavior regarding seeing the good in people. But if I choose not to, at least I'm somewhat present to the fact that this is a thing that I do, right? So jujitsu is a way for us to objectively analyze how and why we act the way we act and think the way we think, because it puts us into this high stakes, high pressure environment where everything is laid bare. Now, we can do this in two ways. We can do this internally and we can do this externally. I actually prefer a hybrid approach because it's impossible for us to see ourselves in our totality, right? Like even just sitting here looking at the camera, talking to you out in cyberspace right now, my field of vision aims right here, or ends right here, rather. And we can extrapolate that analogy. There's all of this going on around me that I cannot see. And sometimes it's worth having others or a camera to document what we cannot see. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have internal feedback loops. That's why on this podcast, I talk about things like journaling, meditation, and other introspective practices, because it allows us to simply sit with what's going on, sit with the state of the water of our existence, feel its temperature, feel its quality. And this is incredibly useful, especially coming off of like a very charged, emotionally raw night last night on the mats. I'm looking forward to the 10-minute window that I'm going to have today where I can just do a seated meditation and be present to all of these feelings and thoughts and how they're affecting the quality or the state of the water today. So that's all good, but it's also entirely subjective. It's coming all through this filter of this thing called Joe from Jersey, which has its faults and is certainly kind of like a fogged mirror in a lot of ways. But that's why we have others involved in our feedback loops. And I think this is the beauty of jiu-jitsu, is that you are constantly engaging in these interactions with other human beings in a group setting where you are wittingly or unwittingly being scrutinized, sized up, challenged, assessed, and in some ways broken and built back up. So that's the role of the team, the sort of sharky waters that we swim in when we engage in live training and we engage in group instruction. And then the other side of that are coaching relationships. And Emily said something to me the other day. She was giving me some feedback on some coaching. And she said that ultimately our role as a coach is to hold up a mirror to people. And they may or may not like what they see in that mirror, but they have to be empowered to make the decision to act on it. And the only way they can act on that information is if we hold that mirror. So a good coach holds up the mirror for you. And this is something that in recent weeks I'm really striving to embody, and I'm really striving to seek in meaningful ways with the numerous coaches that surround me. And I say numerous coaches that surround me because when you progress through the martial arts, I think really around purple belt or brown belt, certainly by black belt, you come to this realization that there is no one person that has all the answers for you technically, right? You need to have a community of coaches all around you. And I think this is one of the beautiful things about our school. I can talk to a guy like Kevin. I can talk to Shane. I can talk to Emily whenever I want. I can talk to even like a brilliant wrestler like Julia Salata, who is one of our instructors. And I can build this ecosystem of coaching, seek their feedback, and then choose what to do with it. But again, it's an active process. I have to build the ecosystem. I have to maintain it. I have to maintain the relationships. And I have to then put the feedback into practice. So ultimately, I think what we're after here is a combination of these internal and external feedback loops. And ultimately, it's up to us to decide what we do with the information that we receive. There's really no coach or training partner out there who can do that aspect for you. And I think we all succeed or fail to a degree in how we accomplish this task. And there have been instances in certainly my personal experience where I have felt extreme lapses in my ability to integrate that feedback or to see things clearly. And I've certainly felt deep shame and remorse around those situations. Like I'll never forget, for example, I was maybe a 2-stripe white belt and I was training at my old school with this really amazing young woman, blue belt at the time. I believe she's a brown belt. She'll probably get her black belt soon. And we were learning the clock sweep from Spider Guard, and I swept her and knocked the wind out of her, and I just immediately felt terrible because she was very emotional about it. I remember she kind of bounced off the mat and said, "You can't do that," caught her breath and started crying, and just felt deeply ashamed because that was not the outcome that I wanted. And I felt like I was out of control. And that moment really stuck with me. And the next day, when the guy who was leading that class, a black belt, proceeded to smash my face under side control to the point where my eye was bruised, and kind of muttering to me the entire time about how I can never do that again. And I'm not really here to discuss the rightness or wrongness of what that black belt did. It's certainly something I would never do or recommend. But it certainly made an impression on me, and it underscored the necessity to really own this process of integrating feedback. So lesson learned, right? And there are countless times when I see people who have not developed this level of self-awareness out in the jiu-jitsu world. Like, for example, I wrote this post, a short story very early in BJJ Meditations called The Visitor, about this person who comes into a school and is just totally oblivious and kind of vanishes into the morning, never to be seen again, says all sorts of outrageous stuff, kind of behaves in ways that make you scratch your head, and is just gone. And it also brings to mind something that Elizabeth Bass has in her Instagram profile. Elizabeth is one of the collaborators here on BJJ Meditations who sometimes does the artwork. But she has, on the tagline of her profile, it says, "This is my house, take off your shoes." Take your shoes off. And from the moment I got to know her, that really struck me. And it's a theme that's come up over and over again on this podcast. And it's a theme that comes up over and over again in the school. Like, for example, in the case of The Visitor, this was a guest in our house, right? And let's look at this metaphor a bit literally. Let's say you are a guest in my house right now, here in New Jersey, and in our house, we don't wear shoes inside. It's our policy. So let's say you arrive and you get the visual cue that there are no shoes being worn in the house. There's a pile of shoes at the door, and you elect to keep your shoes on. Okay. You elect to keep your shoes on. I have a decision to make. Do I correct you or not correct your behavior? Let's say I decide not to correct your behavior because I'm trying to be a gracious host, even though this is the cultural norm of my house. Would you then proceed to wipe your dirty shoes all over the couch? Would you proceed to jump up and down on my bed with your shoes on? Would you proceed to kick my dog with your dirty shoes? Probably not, right? I'm assuming most of you aren't total sociopaths and you kind of understand the import of what I'm describing here. So, it begs the question of like, well, what are your norms when you visit another school? What do you take your shoes off? What is the practice of taking your shoes off in someone else's school look like for you? For example, I've often been, both when I was a younger student and now as an upper belt, I've often been a guest in someone else's school. And even when I was a lower belt, and I'd say especially when I was a lower belt, because when I was a blue belt, I had this job where I was traveling all over the country and training. I would go to these medical conferences, I would find a school, and I would drop in. And I had experiences that ranged from horrifying to extremely gratifying. And I always knew, regardless of where we ended up on that horrifying to gratifying continuum, that I was being watched, that I was being observed. Sometimes it was super apparent. Like, I'll never forget this time when I was in a city and the instructor sized me up and immediately paired me with this huge, much big, like I'm a pretty big dude, you know, I'm like 6'2" and close to 200 pounds. But he sized me up or partnered me up with this guy who was head and shoulders above me and probably outweighed me by like 70 pounds. And while he was a white belt, he clearly was a skilled athlete. He had some wrestling experience, and he also had long fingernails, and he just slashed me to ribbons. I just put him in my clothes guard and I didn't let him out. But it was obvious to me that this guy had paired me up with this student for a reason. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw him observing the entire round. So again, that's a dynamic that I'm conscious of, and I behave accordingly. Almost always when I'm in another school, I am playing, literally playing. I'm not rolling to win. I'm rolling to have fun. I'm trying to have a smile on my face. If I catch something, if I catch some sort of submission, most of the time I let it go. I certainly don't push it to conclusion. I certainly don't push it past a point of this is unsafe. And I do this out of respect. I do this out of respect because I'm a guest in this house, and I do this with the understanding that I'm being watched. And I do this just in kind of like a good-natured way, you know, like I understand that there's a certain amount of relationship building that needs to occur in any scenario such as this, and that I'm coming into this situation, and these people have no context as to who I am. And I'm also coming into this situation as a representative of the school that I'm coming from. And a representative, frankly, of like humanity. Do I want to be a good, valuable human being, or do I want to be sort of like more of a chaotic evil or chaotic neutral human being? Like that's a choice we have to make. And I tend to always choose to be differential when I'm in somebody else's house, so to speak. So, you know, you have to ask yourself, if you are an upper belt listening to this podcast right now, how are you going to behave? Or even if you're a lower belt listening to this podcast right now, what do you think the right way to behave is in someone else's house? And I don't say this in any sort of like moralistic way. This is really a question I think we all need to answer for ourselves as part of this journey toward living an examined life through jiu-jitsu. So on one hand, you could make the argument that by your going easy on other students as a visitor, you're essentially doing them a disservice because you're backing off, right? This is a combat sport. As one of my clients recently regaled me with a story from his boxing days, you know, we're not here doing ballet. There are real consequences for our behaviors here. And maybe shielding people from those consequences is actually doing them a disservice. But then on the other hand, you could argue that as an upper belt, or even just as like a comparably skilled belt, you have a responsibility to see to your training partner's safety. And you should always strive to have control over your technique. And that there's a big difference between training versus competing. And this is kind of where, no, not even kind of, I'm just going to say this directly. This is where I land on the spectrum. This is where my perspective is on this subject. I am 100% committed to this idea of always having responsibility for my training partner and myself. And that's a value that I have arrived at through my journey toward a more examined life in jiu-jitsu. But regardless of what you decide in this hypothetical situation, I would hope that your level of awareness would be sufficient enough to determine that as a visitor, your behavior lacks context. You're coming into this situation totally cold. The people in this community know absolutely nothing about you, and you will be judged accordingly based on how you behave. You may be a fantastic person. You may be a beautiful human, but you need to prove that. You need to realize that respect is earned. It's not given. And you need to realize that there's a limited set of data that people have to make a judgment call about you. And ultimately, it's up to you what you reveal and what you don't reveal and how you behave. And that's going to inform the judgment call. But look, this is feedback we can choose to integrate or not. It's up to us. BJJ, like, it's one of the things I love so much about it is that, yeah, it offers us this opportunity to live an examined life. It's a door, right? It's a pathway we can walk. It's a door we can open to live this examined life. But ultimately, it's up to us whether we walk through the door. And depending on the situation you're in, you may be shown the door too if you don't walk right. And, just as a final thought, I think that back to this idea of, we're all guests, right? Take off your shoes, act accordingly. Ultimately, we're just playing a game here, right? We're playing this infinite game that is jiu-jitsu. You could frame it as a finite game in terms of how many taps you collect, how many trophies you win, how many world championships, whatever. You can play that finite game, or you could just play the game for the love of the game. You could play for the sake of play. I tend to play for the sake of the journey, for the sake of the path, this path of the examined life. And I can also take a step back from all of that, and I can see that, I'm a guest in this school. I'm a guest in this room. I'm a guest in this life. That's really what it's all about to me. Like, we're all just guests in this thing called human consciousness. We're all just here for a finite amount of time. And none of us really knows with certainty whether we get another chance. So I think we should act accordingly. That's really all I've got for you this week on BJJ Meditations. Again, I'm trying to iterate here about what sort of a gathering might look like. If you have any ideas about what you might like to see or participate in a BJJ Meditations gathering, please email me at bjjmeditations@gmail.com. You can go to the website to book online coaching sessions with me or in-person coaching sessions with me. That's the best way to support me. You can also make a donation via Venmo to offset production costs of the podcast. It costs about $15 a month just to host the podcast. So, one small donation really just offsets that for an entire month, and it really makes a big difference. Also, as a reminder, we donate 1% of all pre-tax revenues here at BJJ Meditations to charities supporting anti-climate change initiatives. So your money, and that's coaching engagements. That's also just donations to the podcast. 1% of that before taxes goes to fighting climate change. So that speaks to you. Beautiful. You can check out the highest levels on BJJ Mental Models Premium with me and Emily Kwok. That's kind of where we explore a lot of the modalities from the peak performance consulting space where we work. If you want to try out BJJ Mental Models Premium, there's a try before you buy function. I believe it's a 7-day free trial, so check that out. Please like, subscribe, review, and share the podcast. If it speaks to you, it's the best way to support us other than the other things that I mentioned. Follow BJJ Meditations on BJJ_meditations. You can check out some of my other writing on Substack. That's joehannon.substack.com. And finally, you can come train at Princeton Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Just be a good human being. Thanks, everybody, and we'll talk next week.